There is a certain stillness that lingers in places where once the heartbeat of history resounded. To step into the shadow of a ruined castle is to walk into a conversation between stone and silence where words have long since faded, yet echoes remain. For centuries these castles stood as symbols of power, guardians of trade routes, sentinels of borders, and the centerpieces of communities that thrived around their walls. Yet now they are hushed. Roofs have collapsed, towers are broken, and where banners once fluttered in the wind, there is only the sigh of grass moving across empty courtyards. In this film we will wander through the forgotten castles that fell into silence and ruin, not to recount their battles alone, but to linger upon the stillness that follows when all the voices are gone. It is easy to think of castles as eternal, but they are not. They are monuments to ambition and labor, but also to impermanence. Each block of stone was carried, lifted, and placed by human hands, hands that are long gone, their work left to weather beneath countless seasons. The castle walls may seem unyielding, yet they too bend to the patience of rain and wind, and the creeping roots of nature. To tell their story is to reflect not only upon kings and knights, but upon time itself. Their silence is not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of endurance, a patient reminder that even the strongest creations of humankind eventually yield to the flow of centuries. We begin this journey gently, with no haste, as if walking through a misted valley where the ruins appear slowly out of the morning fog. There is no need to rush. The castles we will visit have already waited hundreds of years, they will wait for us too. Each ruin is like a page half torn from a book, its meaning incomplete, yet carrying the weight of an entire story. Some walls lean precariously, others stand proud though roofless, while many have almost disappeared beneath the greenery. But all of them whisper to those who pause to listen. They tell of feasts once held in echoing halls, of footsteps across stone stairways, of laughter, of arguments, and of prayers muttered before battle. Now those same halls are open to the sky, stairways lead nowhere, and prayers dissolve into the wind. To explore these ruins is to allow the mind to wander backward, to drift gently into imagining the life that once moved within these stones. The creak of a wooden gate, the sound of a drawbridge being lifted, the crackle of torches in the night air, all of these details, though long gone, remain vivid when one stands still within a ruin. The silence itself seems to invite such imagination. For those listening in the quiet, the stones seem to hum softly with memory. But our story will not only speak of castles at their height, gleaming with banners and bustling with soldiers, it will speak of their decline, when the world changed and left them behind. Many were abandoned not because of destruction, but because they were no longer needed. The age of castles ended quietly in many places, as new technologies and new ways of life arose. Where once there was urgency, there came neglect. And neglect, though slower than siege or fire, is just as certain. A leaking roof becomes a broken hall becomes a shell, and soon the forest grows where the dining table once stood. This slow fading is where our focus lies, for there is something profoundly human about watching strength become stillness, and watching silence return to places once filled with sound. As we move forward, we will treat each ruin not as a mere relic of history, but as a presence in the landscape, a shape that continues to influence those who live near it. A castle in ruin is not truly gone. Villagers may look up to it, travelers may pause to admire it, legends may gather around it. Even in silence it remains part of the world, part of the rhythm of time. The people who once depended on these strongholds are gone, but the stones remain to remind us that power, no matter how firm it feels in one age, is always passing into the next. So let us begin this exploration with quiet steps and patient breaths. Let us drift through history, not with the intent of rushing to battles or dates, but with the desire to feel the atmosphere of places that have fallen into ruin. We will let our imaginations follow the slow erosion of stone, the shifting of seasons, and the growth of moss and ivy that now cloak these once mighty walls. This is not a tale of triumph, nor of defeat alone, but a meditation on time, on memory, and on the strange beauty of what remains when all else has gone. In this story, the castles are not only structures, they are voices softened by distance, companions of silence, teachers of patience. Their stillness is not empty, but full. Full of what was, full of what has been lost, and full of what quietly continues in the rhythm of earth and stone. As you listen, allow your thoughts to settle like dust upon old floors, allow your breathing to slow like the wind moving through forgotten towers, and let the silence of these ruins carry you gently, steadily, into the heart of their story. The world in which castles rose was not one of silence but of voices. Across the hills of Europe, the valleys of Britain, the rugged landscapes of the Mediterranean, and even beyond into distant lands, the Middle Ages unfolded with a mixture of hardship and ceremony. Life was woven together by tradition, faith, labor, and necessity. For the ordinary people who lived in small villages and tended fields, the sight of a castle rising against the horizon was more than stone. It was the presence of authority, the shadow of protection, and sometimes the reminder of burdens to be carried. To live in the age of castles was to live in a world where stone walls both sheltered and divided, where banners fluttered not merely for beauty, but to signal loyalty, and where power was marked not by quiet negotiation but by towers visible for miles. The countryside was dotted with small communities bound to the rhythms of the land. Farmers rose with the sun, their days marked by the demands of planting, tending, and harvest. The church bell called the hours, and faith provided both comfort and order. Yet above these villages, often on high ground, a castle would stand, watching. It was more than a residence. It was a statement, a symbol of a lord's claim over the land, a visible marker of control in an age where written borders were less important than what the eye could see. For those who lived nearby, it was impossible to forget its presence. The castle was always there, its silhouette part of the landscape, a constant reminder that authority was not abstract but solid, heavy, and real. Inside the castles lived the nobility, the lords and ladies whose lives were tied to wealth, lineage, and obligation. Their existence was a blend of ceremony and responsibility. They held feasts in great halls not only for celebration but as a way of showing their influence. Their duties extended from hosting travelers to maintaining the loyalty of their knights. Every corner of castle life was structured, layered with meaning, and filled with the sounds of human activity: smiths working at forges, horses clattering in stables, servants moving quickly through passageways, guards keeping their long watches on the walls. To imagine a castle at its height is to imagine a hive of energy, every stone warmed by purpose. The presence of castles extended far beyond the walls. They shaped the lives of everyone within their reach. Markets often grew near their gates, where merchants and villagers could gather under the perceived protection of the lord's soldiers. Roads adjusted their paths to connect with the fortress, and disputes were settled beneath the authority it represented. In troubled times, when raiders or rival forces threatened, the castle became a refuge, a safe hold where villagers crowded into courtyards and prayed for the walls to stand. It was not simply a residence for a noble family, it was the heart of a region, the anchor for a community. The age of castles was also the age of faith, and chapels within their walls held daily prayers. Monks and priests visited, bringing with them the voice of religion that touched all classes. Stained glass windows let colored light fall across stone floors, flickering candle flames filled the air with shadows, and hymns echoed through halls that today lie broken. For those who lived in that time, these places were alive with sounds of devotion, as essential to the rhythm of life as the tolling of a bell at dawn. Castles themselves were varied, reflecting the needs of their regions. Some were towering stone fortresses with vast moats and drawbridges, capable of withstanding prolonged siege. Others were more modest strongholds, half residence and half fortification, designed to watch over valleys or control trade routes. All of them, however, spoke of a common truth: they were built to endure. They were meant to be visible reminders of permanence in a world where lives were fragile and uncertain. For the peasants laboring in fields, for the traders passing through, for the travelers seeking rest, these walls were symbols that life was guided by forces larger than themselves. Yet within this world of order there was also hardship. The Middle Ages were marked by war, famine, and plague. For every feast held in a great hall there were years of hunger in the villages. For every shining night there were countless farmers struggling in mud. The castle stood above it all, its strength contrasting with the vulnerability of the people it overshadowed. This contrast was part of its power. It embodied stability in times of uncertainty. Even when conflict raged, its stone walls seemed eternal, promising survival through chaos. But we must not think of this age as only grim. There was beauty too, and celebration. Festivals spilled into castle courtyards, musicians played lutes and drums, and dancers filled the air with laughter. The rhythm of life carried on, weaving joy and sorrow together into a single tapestry. It was an age of contrasts, and castles were at the very center of those contrasts, magnificent yet demanding, protective yet controlling, admired yet feared. To look back upon that time now is to see a world where the presence of castles gave shape to every horizon. They were the landmarks by which people measured their place in life. They provided structure in both literal and symbolic ways. To stand in the Middle Ages was to stand in a world of stone, a world where the sight of battlements against the sky was as natural as the rising sun. Today, when we look at the same castles in ruin, we must remember the voices that once filled them. The silence we encounter is only recent, only a fragment of their existence. For centuries they were loud with life, and it is this life that we must first recall before we can understand the depth of their stillness. When we picture the age of castles, we must picture not only walls but people, their hopes, their fears, their songs and their labors. Only then can we begin to feel the contrast, the shift from living power to quiet ruin. This is the age we now enter in our story, the age before silence. The castles we shall explore were once bright with banners, full of the voices of men and women whose names are forgotten but whose presence shaped the world. To linger upon these times is to prepare ourselves for what follows, the long decline into stillness. But for now let us remain in this world of stone and life, listening to the hum of a society that found both hardship and hope beneath the watchful gaze of towers that seemed as if they would last forever. The rise of a castle was never sudden. It began with vision, with a lord or ruler standing upon a hill or surveying a valley, imagining a stronghold where there was only earth and sky. Before stone touched stone, there was intention, a decision that a fortress must be built to secure land, to guard borders or to proclaim power. The choice of location was deliberate. High ground was favored, where walls could command the view of the countryside. Riversides were chosen, where water offered both defense and sustenance. Crossroads were marked, where trade could be controlled. Every castle began with thought, with the quiet surveying of land, and with the dream of permanence in a world that knew so much change. When the decision was made, the work began. It was not a single effort but the labor of hundreds, sometimes thousands of hands. Stones had to be quarried, vast blocks cut from the earth with chisels and hammers then hauled over long distances. Timber was felled from nearby forests shaped into scaffolding, beams and gates. Lime was burned for mortar, water fetched in endless buckets to mix with sand. The building of a castle was a community endeavor, with craftsmen and laborers drawn from villages, masons skilled in their trade, carpenters shaping wood and blacksmiths forging nails and hinges. Each person added their small contribution, and together slowly, the walls began to rise. It was not fast work. Castles were built over years, sometimes decades, stone layered upon stone, wall by wall, tower by tower. At the foundation, trenches were dug deep into the earth, and the first stones were set with care, for without strength at the base, no tower could stand tall. The sound of tools echoed through valleys, the sharp ring of chisels on stone, the steady thud of hammers, the creak of wooden pulleys lifting blocks into place. Day after day, the rhythm of construction continued, a human heartbeat against the silence of the landscape. Imagine walking near such a sight in its early days. The air is filled with dust from cut stone, the scent of fresh timber mingles with smoke from forges. Oxen strain as they pull carts heavy with supplies. Men shout instructions, their voices carried over scaffolding, while apprentices hurry with buckets of mortar. It was not peaceful, yet it was purposeful. Every sound, every movement carried the weight of ambition. For those who lived nearby, to watch the steady growth of walls where there was once open sky must have felt like watching the landscape itself change, as though mountains were being made by human hands. The work demanded patience. Masons carefully shaped stones so that each piece would fit tightly against the next, the seams bound with mortar that would harden and hold for centuries. Carpenters built wooden hoardings, temporary structures from which defenders could later watch or fire arrows. Smiths fashioned iron grates, locks and fittings, each glowing red from the forge before being hammered into form. Even children contributed, carrying small loads, fetching water or tending fires. The building of a castle was not the labor of a single class of people but a shared effort, drawn from all levels of society, united by the task of creating something greater than themselves. The design itself was both practical and symbolic. Towers were placed at corners for defense, walls thickened to resist siege engines and gates strengthened with drawbridges and portcullises. Yet alongside these martial features there were also chapels for prayer, halls for feasting, chambers for rest. A castle was both fortress and home, both military post and center of community. To build it was to prepare not only for war but also for daily life, for seasons of peace and gathering, for rituals and traditions. There was artistry as well as strength in the work. Stonemasons carved details into arches and doorways, adding flourishes to what might otherwise have been plain walls. Windows were cut with precision to allow light, and sometimes colored glass was fitted to fill the rooms with gentle hues. The effort was not merely to create a shelter but to create a statement. A castle was meant to inspire awe, to show that its lord was powerful, wealthy, and enduring. Its very existence was a proclamation, written not in words but in stone. The process could be dangerous. Scaffolding sometimes collapsed, heavy stones could slip, fires from forges could spread. Laborers risked injury each day, and many likely bore scars from their work. Yet the building continued, season after season, because the reward was permanence, the promise of a structure that would outlive the builders themselves. To be part of castle construction was to take part in something that reached beyond an individual lifespan, into the realm of legacy. Over time, the walls rose higher, towers pierced the sky, and gates stood firm. What began as earth and timber became a fortress of stone. For those who had lived their entire lives in simple wooden homes, the sight of such rising walls must have been staggering. It was a new order taking shape before their eyes, one that changed how they thought of power, safety, and time. Where wood would rot, stone endured. Where homes might be rebuilt in a season, a castle would remain for generations. As the final touches were added, roofs laid upon towers, banners fixed upon battlements, chapels consecrated with prayer, the castle became complete. Yet it was never truly finished. Over years additions would be made, towers expanded, halls repaired, moats deepened. A castle was a living structure, adapting to the needs of each new generation, yet always holding within its walls the memory of those who first lifted the stones into place. Today, when we walk among castle ruins, it is easy to see only the silence, the stillness of broken walls, but to remember their construction is to recall the noise, the effort, the relentless determination of those who built them. The stones we see crumbling were once fresh and sharp, lifted with sweat and skill, fitted with precision. The towers that lean today once stood proudly, straight and defiant. The silence of the present is layered upon the noise of the past, and to tell the story of forgotten castles we must not forget the effort that brought them into being. A castle is in many ways the story of its making. The choice of the hill, the quarrying of stone, the labor of countless hands, the shaping of wood and iron, the artistry of masons, all of this remains in the very bones of the ruin. Though the builders are gone, their touch lingers in each block, each joint, each tower. To stand before a castle is to stand before the memory of its creation, a memory that whispers still, even when all else has fallen silent. To step inside a castle at the height of its life was to enter a world that seemed entirely self-contained. Beyond the gates, beyond the thick wooden doors and iron fittings lay a society enclosed within stone. The walls, so high and imposing from the outside, sheltered a network of spaces, each serving a purpose, each filled with activity. A castle was not simply a building, it was a community within itself, a place where many lives intertwined, where routines unfolded each day, and where the sounds of human presence echoed against stone long before the silence of ruin ever came. At the heart of every castle was the great hall. This vast chamber with its high beams and long tables served as the center of life. It was here that the lord and lady presided over meals, where feasts were held, where disputes were settled, and where stories were told beside roaring fires. Imagine the glow of torches flickering against the walls, the sound of goblets striking wood, the hum of conversation rising and falling like waves. The air carried the scents of roasted meat, spiced wine, and smoke from the great hearth. For those who lived in the castle, the hall was not merely a room, it was a stage upon which the rhythms of authority, loyalty, and celebration played out. Yet not all moments were grand. Much of castle life was ordinary, filled with simple tasks that kept the household functioning. Servants moved quietly through corridors, carrying food, cleaning chambers, and tending fires. In kitchens, cooks worked before open flames, stirring pots that hung from blackened hooks, preparing bread baked in large ovens, and seasoning stews that could feed dozens. The clang of pots and the chopping of vegetables echoed through the lower levels, creating a constant background of labor. Above, in private chambers, maids tended to clothing, brushed garments free of dust, and repaired fabrics worn by daily use. Even in a fortress of stone, life was made up of countless small details, each task contributing to the comfort and order of those who lived within. For the nobility, the castle was a place of both duty and display. The Lord's day might begin with counsel, hearing petitions from villagers or managing disputes among his retainers. Knights sworn to his service would train in the yard below, their armor clattering as they practiced with swords, lances, and shields. Their movements, disciplined and repetitive, prepared them for battles that might or might not come. Pages and squires hurried after them, carrying equipment, learning by watching, dreaming of the day when they too would ride beneath the Lord's banner. Each step of this hierarchy was visible, unfolding daily in the courtyards and passageways of the castle. Beyond the martial life there was also devotion. Most castles included a chapel, a small but significant space set aside for prayer. The rhythm of faith guided daily routines, with services held at dawn and evening, bells marking sacred hours. Here the air was still, carrying the faint scent of wax from candles, the murmur of voices reciting prayers, the soft echo of hymns against vaulted ceilings. While battles and feasts were moments of noise, the chapel was a place of quiet constancy. It reminded all within the walls that life, however grand or fleeting, was part of something larger than the stone that enclosed them. The castle was also home to music and storytelling. Minstrels and bards were welcomed into the great halls, their songs recounting tales of heroes, romances, and distant lands. Their voices carried across rafters, filling the stone spaces with warmth. For those listening, these songs were more than entertainment, they were threads of connection to a wider world. Children grew up with such stories, their imaginations shaped by the cadence of old legends. In winter nights when cold crept into the walls, these performances gave life to the halls, a reminder that human spirit could flourish even in the most fortified spaces. Daily life was layered with contrast. The stone walls suggested permanence, yet within them life was fragile and ever-changing. The nobility dined on rich foods in the great hall, while servants ate simpler meals in quieter corners. Lords and ladies dressed in fine fabrics, while peasants and laborers wore garments of wool and leather worn thin by work. The sounds of laughter might carry from one chamber, while the silence of a sickbed lingered in another. Castles contained both joy and sorrow, both triumph and loss, bound together in the same enclosed space. The seasons shaped this life as well. In summer, courtyards bustled with activity, washing hung to dry, soldiers trained, and travelers arrived through the gates. In winter the same courtyards grew still, covered in frost, fires working constantly to keep chambers warm. The thick walls held back wind, but draughts still slipped through narrow windows and the cold seeped into every corner. Life within the castle adapted to these changes, shifting with the weather, mirroring the world outside even as the walls sought to keep it at bay. Children too were part of castle life, running through halls, learning their letters or watching knights at practice with wide eyes. Their games echoed in passageways, their laughter mixing with the sounds of labor. Some would grow into squires, others into ladies of households, their lives shaped from birth by the rhythms of stone walls. To imagine the ruins today without such voices is to forget that they once rang with the energy of youth, with the promise of futures that have long since passed. Trade and travel reached into these lives as well. Merchants brought fabrics, spices, and goods from distant lands. Messengers arrived with news from other regions, carrying letters sealed in wax, bringing with them tidings of alliances, wars, or shifting powers. The castle was never truly isolated. Even in remote valleys it was connected to broader networks, its inhabitants aware that their lives were woven into a larger tapestry of kingdoms and realms. To walk through a castle in its prime would have been to see all of this at once. Servants hurrying, knights training, children playing, the lord in council, the lady overseeing the household, prayers rising in chapels, songs drifting through halls. The space was alive, filled with motion, filled with voices. It was a place of command and community, where the strength of walls mirrored the strength of human intention. When we visit a ruin today, when we see only crumbled stone and quiet pathways, we must imagine these lives once moving through the same spaces. The silence is striking only because it follows such a chorus. The empty halls were once crowded, the broken staircases once carried footsteps, the open courtyards once rang with noise. To understand the stillness of ruins, we must first understand the fullness of the lives that once filled them. The life inside a castle was not glamorous for all, nor easy for most, but it was vibrant. It was shaped by responsibility, by faith, by labor, by joy, and by hardship. It was a reflection of the human story itself held within stone walls that both protected and confined. The echoes we hear in ruins today are the remnants of that life, softened by centuries but never entirely gone. They remind us that a castle was never just a structure, it was a living place, a small world enclosed in stone, carrying within it the voices of all who once called it home. A castle was never only a home, it was, above all, a fortress, a structure built to endure pressure, to resist enemies, and to hold firm when the world outside turned hostile. The thick walls, the high towers, the moats and drawbridges, these were not ornaments but defenses carefully designed to withstand trial. To live within a castle was to live with the constant knowledge that its strength might one day be tested. For centuries, castles stood as both symbols of stability and as front lines in the struggles that shaped kingdoms. And when war came, the castle was asked to do what it had been built for, to endure. The story of a siege began long before the first arrow flew. Often it began with warning, with the approach of an enemy host seen from the watchtowers, dust rising along distant roads, banners flickering on the horizon. Messengers carried word, bells rang out, villagers left their homes and crowded into the safety of the castle walls. In courtyards once filled with daily tasks, people gathered in anxious groups, bringing with them their livestock, their grain, their children. The castle became a refuge, its gates closing not only to keep invaders out but to hold entire communities in. Once the gates closed, life changed. The rhythms of ordinary days gave way to the strict discipline of survival. Food was rationed, water guarded, supplies counted with care. Soldiers took their posts on the walls, their eyes fixed on the encampments forming beyond. Nights were no longer quiet, for watchmen paced in armor, scanning the darkness for movement, listening for the creak of siege engines or the muffled steps of approaching scouts. Within the castle, the sound of hammers echoed as carpenters repaired gates, smiths sharpened blades, and arrows were bundled in stacks. The air was tense, filled not with celebration but with anticipation. Outside, the enemy prepared as well. They built their own machines, great wooden towers rolled on wheels, catapults strung with ropes, ladders ready to be lifted against the walls. Fires might be set to weaken gates, tunnels dug to undermine foundations. Siege was not only force, it was patience, a slow contest of endurance between those inside and those outside. Days stretched into weeks, sometimes into months, as each side waited for the other to weaken. Inside the castle, the people endured. Soldiers kept guard, but families waited too. Children hushed, elders whispering prayers. The great halls that once held feasts now echoed with the sound of murmured worry, and smoke from cooking fires lingered heavily in enclosed spaces. Supplies dwindled with each passing day. Bread grew stale, meat salted long before the siege was called upon for sustenance, and clean water became more precious than gold. Yet the walls still stood, and so long as they held, hope remained. There were moments of sudden violence when engines outside launched stones that thundered against towers, shaking the very ground. Arrows rained down, striking against shields, embedding into wood, clattering across stone courtyards. The air filled with shouts, the clash of weapons, the roar of defenders answering attacks. But often between these moments there was silence. Long stretches of waiting filled the days where nothing seemed to move except the smoke rising from campfires outside the walls. These quiet hours were heavy, pressing down on those inside, reminding them that endurance was as much about patience as it was about strength. For the defenders, the castle itself was both ally and cage. Its walls offered protection, but they also confined. There was no leaving until the siege was lifted. The sense of being enclosed was powerful, of being suspended in time, each day blending into the next as everyone waited for resolution. Yet this was the very design of the castle: to enclose, to protect, to turn time itself into a weapon, forcing the enemy to tire, to hunger, to lose resolve. In many sieges it was not the assault that broke the defenders or the attackers, but the long wait of waiting, the slow erosion of spirit. Some sieges ended in violence, with gates breached, walls scaled, and defenders overwhelmed. In those moments, the castle that had stood proudly became a battlefield within its own walls, its courtyards filled with clashing steel, its halls echoing with the cries of conflict. Yet many others ended with survival. The enemy, unable to break the defenses, would withdraw, leaving the castle scarred but standing. To endure a siege was to prove the worth of the stone, the labor of builders, and the courage of those who stood behind the walls. Not all attacks were from outside. Hunger and fear could gnaw from within. Disease sometimes broke out during sieges, spreading quickly in crowded spaces where air was heavy and clean water scarce. Trust could falter, hope could wane. Yet even in these moments the castle reminded its inhabitants of endurance. Its walls stood firm even when human spirit wavered, a reminder that strength could still be found in stone. The experience of siege became part of the memory of each castle. Stories were told of the times when arrows darkened the sky, when fire raged at the gates, when defenders held fast upon the walls. These stories gave meaning to the stones, turning them from mere buildings into monuments of resilience. For those who later walked their halls in peace, these memories lingered like invisible shadows, shaping how they understood the place in which they lived. To speak of castles is to speak of survival, of the long struggle to remain standing against all that threatened. Even when peace returned, the scars of siege remained. Stones blackened by fire, towers rebuilt after collapse, gates strengthened where they had once splintered. Each mark was a reminder that strength was tested, that silence was not always peaceful, that survival often came through hardship. Yet in telling these stories now, in the soft light of history, there is no need for urgency or fear. The sieges are long past, the walls that once shook now crumble quietly, the weapons that once thundered lie silent in museums or are lost beneath the earth. What remains is the memory of endurance, the knowledge that these castles stood firm when all else was threatened. In this they are not only ruins but teachers. They remind us that strength can be patient, that survival can be quiet, that sometimes the greatest victory is simply to remain. As we imagine the life of siege and defense, we can hear faintly the echoes of that struggle, but we hear them through the veil of time, softened, almost dreamlike. The clash of steel fades into a distant murmur. The shouts of soldiers are carried away by centuries of wind. What remains is not the violence but the endurance, not the fear but the stillness that follows. To sit with these ruins now is to sit with the memory of survival, to feel how much was endured before silence finally arrived. There comes a time in every story when the moment of greatness begins to pass. For castles that moment was not sudden but slow, a gradual fading rather than a single collapse. The same walls that once inspired awe, that stood as the very symbols of strength, began to grow less necessary. Change arrived quietly at first in the shape of new ideas, new weapons and new ways of living, until finally the age of castles gave way to something different. The great shift came with the rise of gunpowder. The stone walls that had once turned aside arrows and catapult stones could not so easily resist the blast of cannons. The thunder of gunfire echoed differently across the land, making old defenses seem fragile in comparison. A high tower that once gave commanding views became a liability, an easy target for artillery. Slowly, the very designs that had made castles so powerful became their undoing. Walls meant to repel were now shattered by force, and builders began to look elsewhere for protection. Yet it was not only weapons that brought decline, life itself was changing. Kingdoms grew larger, governments more centralized, and the role of lords and knights shifted. The medieval world, with its small feudal domains, its constant local conflicts, and its need for fortified strongholds, began to dissolve. In its place rose larger states, organized armies, and cities that became centers of power. The castle, once the very heart of authority, no longer stood at the center of every struggle. Within their walls, the life of castles also began to soften. Great halls that had echoed with war councils and guarded feasts were transformed into more comfortable dwellings. The cold stone that had once symbolized security was now less appealing in times of peace. Nobles sought lighter, brighter homes, palaces filled with glass windows, gardens, and decoration. Castles were not abandoned all at once, but they were transformed, their harsh defenses turned into symbols of an earlier, rougher time. As decades turned to centuries, neglect set in. Where once armies had marched to reinforce walls, now moss began to grow between the stones. Wooden roofs weakened, towers crumbled, gates sagged with age. Some castles were dismantled deliberately, their stones reused for new homes, churches, or bridges. Others were left simply to fade, their decline unnoticed except by those who lived in their shadows. Yet even in decline, castles did not lose their presence. For villagers nearby, the ruins became part of the landscape, reminders of a different age. Children grew up hearing stories of battles fought long before, tales passed down of knights and sieges, of triumphs and tragedies. The crumbling towers and silent halls became woven into folklore, standing as both reality and legend. The silence of decline was different from the silence of siege. No longer filled with waiting and tension, it was instead a stillness of abandonment, of stones slowly loosening under the weight of years. Birds nested in high windows where once archers had stood. Ivy curled around towers that no longer served as lookouts. The air that had once been filled with the clang of weapons and the murmur of courts now carried only the whisper of wind. For those who walked among them in later centuries, the ruins of castles carried a quiet melancholy. Travelers paused to look at broken walls rising above hillsides, imagining what life might once have been within. Writers and poets drew inspiration from these remains, speaking of glory faded, of strength humbled, of time as the most powerful conqueror of all. In the fading light of evening, a ruined castle could seem less like a building and more like a memory made solid, something halfway between history and dream. And yet, decline was not without meaning. Castles that fell into ruin became monuments to endurance in another way. Though their towers crumbled, their outlines still marked the land. Though their roofs fell, their foundations remained firm. Though no longer useful for defense, they continued to speak in their silence of the ages they had survived. Each stone still carried the weight of the hands that had placed it. Each wall still bore the echoes of voices long gone. In this way, decline became transformation. Castles lost their military power, but they gained another role, that of memory keepers. They became places where the past remained visible, where people could walk and feel the nearness of centuries, where silence carried not emptiness but depth. To see a ruin was to glimpse both what once was and what time always does to everything, to everyone, to every great creation of human hands. Today, when we think of castles, we often imagine them as ruins first, rather than as bustling centers of medieval life. The image of broken walls against the sky has become almost more iconic than the castles in their prime. This too is part of their story. Decline was not an ending but a transformation into a new kind of existence, one less about defense and more about reflection. The fall of castles into ruin is therefore not a failure but a reminder. It tells us that strength must always adapt, that even the mightiest structures eventually give way to change. And yet, it also tells us that nothing truly disappears. The stones remain, the stories remain, the sense of presence remains. In their quiet, in their silence, castles continue to speak, softly but clearly, even centuries after their decline began. Now, when we walk among them, there is no fear of siege, no call to arms, no weight of rations or watches. There is only calm, the kind of calm that comes after long struggle, the calm of acceptance. Decline may have taken away their power, but it has left them with something else, the gift of silence, a silence that invites us not to fight, but to listen, to imagine, to rest. When a castle slipped from power, when its lords departed and its defenses were no longer needed, it did not simply vanish. The stones remained, patient and immovable, watching the years pass. Slowly, the grand designs of builders gave way to the quiet designs of time. Roofs collapsed, towers crumbled, walls bent beneath centuries of wind and rain. Yet even in their broken state, castles did not disappear. They remained as ruins scattered across landscapes like echoes left behind, reminders that the past still lingered in stone. The sight of a ruined castle in the distance carries a certain calm. Rising from a hilltop or settled beside a river, the broken walls seem both proud and weary, strong yet surrendered. Their presence is unmistakable, but it is softened by the passage of time. What was once harsh and imposing now feels almost gentle, woven into the land rather than standing apart from it. Nature begins its slow work, ivy climbing where banners once waved, moss covering stones once polished by footsteps, trees leaning into walls that once held firm against armies. In this quiet transformation, the castle changes its role. No longer a fortress, it becomes a part of the natural world. Birds nest in windows where guards once watched. Small flowers bloom between cracks where swords once clashed. The silence of the ruin is filled with softer sounds, the rustle of leaves, the call of distant birds, the murmur of wind threading through broken archways. The ruin becomes less a symbol of war and more a sanctuary of stillness. For those who lived near them, ruins were never only silent stones. They were landmarks shaping the rhythms of daily life. Shepherds guided flocks past their shadows. Farmers worked fields in sight of old towers. Children grew up inventing stories of the lives once lived there, peering through empty windows as though they might catch glimpses of knights or ladies long gone. The ruin became not only a presence in the landscape, but a presence in imagination. Travelers too found meaning in ruins. To come across a castle, half fallen, half standing, was to encounter history in a direct and tangible form. Unlike stories written in books or told by word of mouth, the ruin carried its memory in silence. It needed no explanation. Its broken walls spoke simply by existing, reminding all who saw them that time moves forward, that strength is never eternal, that beauty can remain even after use has faded. Poets and painters were drawn to ruins, capturing their forms as emblems of melancholy beauty. A broken tower silhouetted against the evening sky, a gateway open to nothing but grass and air, a hall where roof beams lay shattered. These images became symbols not only of castles but of memory itself. In their quiet decay, ruins reflected the human experience of loss and endurance, of endings that are never quite complete. And yet, despite their brokenness, many ruins still carried hints of their former power. A tall wall still rising high above the land, a surviving keep standing firm against centuries of storms. These fragments suggested what once had been. To walk among them was to feel both the grandeur of the past and the softness of the present. The balance between strength and fragility gave ruins their unique character. They were neither wholly alive nor wholly gone, existing in a space between. The presence of ruins also changed with the seasons. In summer, wildflowers might bloom in courtyards once filled with soldiers. In autumn, leaves would drift across fallen stones, their colors bright against the gray. In winter, snow softened every broken edge, making the ruin appear almost whole again, as though time had briefly reversed. With each season, the ruin took on a new atmosphere, a reminder that even in decay, life continued to flow around it. For those seeking rest, ruins became places of reflection. Their silence was not empty, but deep, layered with centuries of memory. Sitting within a ruined hall, one could imagine the feasts once held there, but hear only the quiet hum of bees in the grass. Standing upon a broken wall, one could picture the soldiers once stationed there, but see only the endless horizon. The contrast was not unsettling, it was calming, a reminder that conflict passes, but peace endures. The transformation of castles into ruins also ensured their survival in a different way. While new palaces replaced them as centers of power, the ruins remained rooted in the land, harder to erase than to rebuild. They became part of the scenery, inseparable from the hills and rivers around them. In some places, entire villages grew around these ruins, the old walls standing beside new homes, their history woven into daily life. In others, they stood alone, distant and quiet, waiting for travelers to rediscover them. Time, which once seemed an enemy to the builders, became a collaborator in creating beauty. Cracks, weathering and collapse turned rigid structures into flowing shapes softened by earth and vegetation. The stern symmetry of fortresses gave way to gentle irregularity, arches opening into the sky, stairways leading to nowhere, halls open to rain and stars. The ruin became not a broken building, but a new kind of form, half human creation, half natural sculpture. In their silence, ruins invite us not to rush, but to pause, to look carefully at the details, the carving still visible in worn stone, the curve of a collapsed doorway, the way a single wall still stands tall while all around it has fallen. These details remind us that even in ruin, traces of intention remain. The builder's hands are still present, though centuries have passed. Today, as we visit ruins, we often experience them not with fear or urgency, but with calm curiosity. We walk slowly through broken gates, we linger by walls that frame the sky, we take in the atmosphere of quiet persistence. The stories of war and power are softened by time, leaving behind something gentler, the beauty of endurance, the peace of silence. Castles that fell into ruin did not fall into nothingness. They shifted into another form of presence, one less about dominance and more about memory. They became part of the land, part of the imagination, part of the rhythm of time itself. Their silence is not empty, it is full, filled with echoes, with reminders, with the calm assurance that nothing truly vanishes, but instead changes into something new. When stone walls began to crumble and halls stood empty, the story of castles did not come to an end. Instead, another story began. One not written in stone but whispered in voices, carried in tales and embroidered into the fabric of folklore. For centuries, people living in the shadows of these ruins wove them into their imaginations, filling the silence of empty towers with legends. What could not be explained by history was answered with stories, and castles that had fallen into ruin found new life in the realm of myth. It is a quiet truth that abandoned places often invite wonder. A courtyard overgrown with grass, a stairway leading into shadow, a doorway opening onto nothing. All these become invitations for the mind to wander. What was once practical becomes mysterious. And so in villages nearby, people told stories to explain what they saw, stories that gave shape to the silence of the ruins. Some castles were said to be haunted. The clatter of armor on a moonlit night might be explained as the echo of ghostly knights still pacing along their posts long after their duty had ended. A faint cry carried on the wind could be imagined as the voice of someone who once lived or died within those walls. Shadows seen through broken windows were not only tricks of light but reminders of lives unfinished. These tales gave the ruins not only history but presence, an invisible life continuing even after the visible one had gone. Other castles became the stage for legends of treasure. Buried beneath their floors or hidden deep within forgotten cellars, great riches were said to sleep, guarded by spirits or curses. Children grew up hearing that gold lay just beneath the stones they walked on, though few dared to seek it. In these stories, castles became not only memories of the past but promises of mystery, their silence hinting at secrets still waiting to be uncovered. There were also tales of figures larger than life. Kings who returned in disguise, knights who never truly died, queens whose beauty lingered in moonlit halls. Some castles became linked with great heroes, others with tragic figures who were said to walk endlessly in sorrow. Folklore blurred the line between what had truly happened and what people wished, feared, or wondered about. To speak of a castle was often to speak of more than stone, it was to speak of imagination made solid. As centuries passed, poets and storytellers carried these legends further. Ballads were sung of maidens locked in towers, of warriors defending gates against impossible odds, of rulers betrayed within their own walls. The ruins themselves became stages upon which imagination performed, each broken archway a doorway into another tale, each dark chamber a place where mystery lingered. Even when people no longer remembered the real battles or rulers, they remembered the stories that grew in their place. The ghostly presence of castles was not always fearful, sometimes it was protective. Villagers told of guardian spirits who kept watch, ensuring that the land around the ruins remained safe. A crumbling tower seen from afar might reassure travelers that they were not alone, that the past was still near, that unseen protectors lingered. In this way, ruins became part of local identity, their myths tying people to place in ways deeper than stone. Nighttime especially gave life to these legends. As the sun set and shadows lengthened, the shape of a ruin could shift in imagination. A wall that seemed broken by day might, under moonlight, look whole again. Windows might gleam as though lit from within, though no fires burned. Silence itself, so complete and still, could stir the sense that someone or something was listening. These moments of quiet unease were not meant to terrify but to remind. They suggested that the past was never fully gone, that history remained close, woven into the present like a faint voice just beyond hearing. Children sitting by firesides often heard these stories first. Elders told them gently, half warning, half wonder, shaping how the young looked upon the ruins they passed on daily walks. The tales made the ruins feel alive, not abandoned but inhabited by memory. In this way, folklore became as enduring as stone, passed from one generation to the next, even as the castles themselves crumbled further. Over time, the legends of castles blended with broader myths. Some became associated with dragons who were said to coil in dungeons, their breath rising like mist through cracks in the earth. Others were linked to fairies who danced in hidden chambers or left signs of their passing in wildflowers that grew along walls. The boundary between history and fantasy dissolved until castles were seen as doorways not only into the past but into entire realms of imagination. For travelers centuries later, encountering these tales was part of the experience of visiting ruins. To walk beneath an old gateway was to step into both history and legend. Even today, guides speak of ghostly appearances, of hidden chambers, of mysteries unsolved. Whether one believes them or not, the effect is the same. The ruins feel more alive, more filled with presence than their silence alone could provide. And yet, beneath all the stories there is something constant, the sense that castles, even in ruin, are not empty. They hold memory, they hold imagination. They invite those who come near to wonder, to slow down, to listen carefully to the quiet. The folklore that grew around them reflects not only fear or curiosity but also the human need to find meaning in what lingers. Castles standing silent became mirrors for that need, offering spaces where story and silence met. Now when we think of castles we rarely separate stone from story. The broken tower and the ghostly knight, the ivy-covered wall and the hidden treasure, the silent courtyard and the whispered legend, all are part of the same presence. Folklore has ensured that ruins are not forgotten, that they live not only in landscapes but in minds, in songs, in the gentle passing of tales across generations. In the end, these stories do not disturb the silence of ruins, they deepen it. They add layers to the quiet so that when we stand before a broken wall we hear not only the wind but also the centuries of whispers that have gathered there. The ruins remain calm, steady, unchanging, while imagination continues to circle them like a gentle current. And in that blending of silence and story, castles continue to live, softly, quietly, endlessly. By the time the 18th and 19th centuries arrived, many castles had already been long abandoned, their stones worn, their halls empty, their names half forgotten. Yet in this quiet decline they found an unexpected second life. A new generation looked upon these ruins not as failures or remnants of war, but as places of beauty, of inspiration, of quiet poetry written in stone. The Romantic era, with its love of the mysterious and the melancholy, rediscovered castles and gave them new meaning. For centuries, castles had been practical things, fortresses of defense, homes of power, symbols of rule. But when seen through romantic eyes, they became something different. The crumbling towers, the ivy-covered walls, the broken staircases, all of these were no longer signs of decay but signs of endurance, reminders that beauty could be found in what time had softened. The ruin, instead of being a loss, became a source of wonder. Travelers began to seek them out deliberately. Writers wandered through empty courtyards, sketching scenes in notebooks, describing the way sunlight fell through roofless halls. Painters stood before collapsed gates, capturing how shadows played across cracked stone. Poets listened to the silence within towers and translated it into verse. What had once been forgotten fortresses now became stages upon which imagination performed. There was something profoundly moving in the contrast. A castle had been built for strength, yet it was most admired when that strength had faded. It had been designed to resist time, yet it was most beautiful once time had left its mark. The Romantics saw in this contradiction a reflection of life itself, glory and decline, strength and fragility, permanence and impermanence. In the ruins of castles they found truths that went beyond stone. Many travelers wrote of the emotions stirred by these sights. A ruined tower against the evening sky inspired feelings of both sorrow and calm. An empty window framing the horizon seemed to speak of both absence and possibility. Standing within a hall open to the weather was like standing inside memory itself, surrounded by walls that had forgotten their original purpose but still held a quiet dignity. These impressions were not only historical, they were deeply personal, touching on the human experience of loss, endurance and beauty found in change. Artists painted ruins bathed in soft light, surrounded by trees or perched above rivers. In their canvases, castles looked less like fortresses and more like dreams. Poets too turned them into symbols. A broken arch could become an image of love lost, a fallen wall a metaphor for time's patience, a shadowed chamber a place where memory lingered. The Romantic imagination gave castles lives far beyond their historical use, making them symbols of emotion, reflection and quiet contemplation. The rise of tourism also brought new attention to ruins. As roads improved and curiosity grew, people traveled to see castles not for defense but for delight. Guidebooks described them, engravings illustrated them, and travelers carried stories back home. The ruins became destinations, their silence shared with more visitors than ever before. Yet even with more eyes upon them, they kept their calm. To stand in a ruin, even surrounded by others, was to feel drawn into stillness, into a space that seemed to exist outside of ordinary time. The Romantic rediscovery of ruins also changed how people thought about history itself. Before, history had often been told as lists of rulers, wars and victories, but when seen through the lens of ruins, history became something more human, more tender. It became about memory, about the passage of time, about the ways in which even great structures eventually softened into the landscape. Castles reminded people that history was not only battles but also silence, that it lived not only in books but in places where one could stand and feel it in the air. Some ruins even inspired acts of preservation. While many castles continued to crumble, others were stabilized, cared for, and protected so that future generations could continue to see them. The romantic fascination with ruins laid the groundwork for heritage movements that valued not only what was new but also what was old, what had endured, and what spoke softly of the past. In this way, castles gained a new kind of immortality. They were no longer needed as fortresses but they became treasured as symbols. They no longer shaped battles but they shaped imagination. The Romantic era taught people to see ruins not as failures but as gifts, places where beauty could be found in imperfection, and where silence could speak more clearly than words. Walking among the ruins in this time, one might have seen not only broken walls but also groups of artists sketching, poets scribbling, travelers pausing to reflect. Each person added their own layer to the meaning of the place. The ruins became mirrors reflecting whatever emotion one brought to them: sorrow, wonder, hope, or calm. Today, when we visit castles, we inherit much of this romantic way of seeing. We do not expect to find armies or rulers within. We expect instead to find beauty, silence, and the gentle presence of the past. We take photographs where painters once set up easels, we write thoughts where poets once wrote verses, we walk slowly through ruins in the same way travelers once did, pausing, listening, imagining. The romantic rediscovery lives on in how we continue to approach these places, and so the castles that once seemed forgotten were remembered anew. Their silence was not an absence but an invitation, their brokenness was not weakness but beauty. Their ruins were not the end of their story, but the beginning of another chapter, one written not in battles or rulers but in the quiet hearts of those who came to see them. In the Romantic gaze, castles became more than stone. They became symbols of time's passage, of memory's endurance, of beauty found not in perfection but in imperfection. They remind us still, even now, that what has fallen is not lost, that silence can speak as deeply as sound, and that the ruins of the past can become places of rest for the imagination. Today, when we think of castles, we rarely imagine them as they once were, filled with soldiers, echoing with voices of kings and lords, or braced against the weight of siege. Instead, we imagine them as we see them now, gentle ruins resting in the landscape, their walls softened by centuries, their towers broken but still proud, their silence deep and calming. In the modern world, castles have shifted once again. They are no longer fortresses of defense but places of remembrance, of learning, of quiet reflection. Visitors walk through them not in armor but in comfortable shoes. The clang of weapons is replaced by the sound of footsteps on stone paths, the shuffle of leaves in the wind, the quiet murmur of voices echoing off empty walls. Children explore their stairways with curiosity while adults pause to look outward from broken battlements, imagining the view as it once was. Tourists bring cameras, sketchbooks, or simply their eyes, capturing the ruins not for war but for wonder. Preservation efforts have ensured that many castles once at risk of being swallowed by time, now endure in new ways. Archaeologists carefully study foundations, historians piece together forgotten stories, and architects stabilize walls to prevent collapse. These efforts are not meant to restore castles to their former power, but to honor their present silence. The goal is not to erase their ruin but to let their ruin remain safely as part of the landscape. Each scar, each broken arch, each weathered stone is preserved not as a flaw but as part of the story. In this way, modern ruins are a balance between care and decay. Left entirely alone, some would vanish into earth and forest. Restored completely, they might lose the atmosphere that makes them powerful. So preservation walks a gentle path, keeping the stones steady while leaving the marks of time visible. Visitors can walk through them and feel both history and nature, both endurance and fragility. The role of ruins in modern life is also deeply symbolic. They remind us that strength is not always permanence, that even the mightiest structures are shaped by time. In a world that often moves quickly, ruins ask us to slow down. To walk among them is to step outside the rush of daily life and into a slower rhythm, one measured not in hours but in centuries. The silence of a ruined hall can feel like a pause, a gentle invitation to breathe and reflect. For local communities, ruins are also anchors of identity. A castle rising above a village is more than a backdrop, it is a reminder of continuity, a symbol that has watched over generations. Festivals, gatherings, and quiet walks all take place under their presence. Even in ruin, castles continue to shape the lives of those around them, offering a sense of connection to both place and past. Tourism has brought many to these ruins, and with it stories continue to spread. Travelers from across the world walk through the same gates that once saw knights and kings. They hear not the sound of horns or drums but the explanations of guides, the gentle flow of history retold in calm tones. And while some come seeking adventure, many come seeking peace, hoping to stand in a place where time feels slower, where the modern world feels far away, where silence feels more complete. There is also something healing in ruins. Their brokenness does not inspire despair but comfort. They remind us that life is always changing, that endings are not the end but transformations. A wall that has stood for 800 years, though cracked and worn, still stands. A tower without a roof still reaches upward toward the sky. These quiet forms remind us that endurance does not mean remaining untouched, it means remaining present. In the evenings when most visitors have gone, ruins return to their deeper silence. The wind moves gently through broken archways. Shadows stretch across stone courtyards. The birds that have made their nests among the towers settle for the night. In those hours the castles return most fully to themselves, not as crowded sites of tourism but as timeless presences in the landscape. It is then that one feels most strongly the weight of centuries, the quiet persistence of stone. Modern ruins are also places of learning. Schools bring students to walk their grounds, to see with their own eyes the architecture, the history, the stories that textbooks alone cannot capture. For young minds, the ruins are more than relics, they are living classrooms, teaching not only about war and kings but about time, memory and change. And for artists, just as in the Romantic era, ruins remain an endless source of inspiration. Photographers capture their silhouettes against the sky. Writers use them as backdrops for stories, blending history and imagination. Painters still find beauty in their irregular lines, their softened forms, their blend of human creation and natural reclamation. The ruin continues to invite creativity just as it once invited legend. Perhaps the most powerful role of modern ruins, however, is their gift of perspective. They remind us that all things change, that power rises and falls, that silence follows sound. Yet they also remind us that what fades can still endure in another form. Castles no longer guard against armies, but they guard against forgetfulness. They keep memory alive not through strength but through presence, through the quiet way they remain. For those who visit, the experience is rarely hurried. People walk slowly, pausing to touch the stone, to peer through empty windows, to stand in doorways open to the sky. They do not rush through as they might in a busy city. They move gently, almost reverently, as though the ruins themselves ask for a quieter pace. And in that slowing, visitors find something of themselves, a chance to rest, to reflect, to be still. In this way, castles in ruin serve us even now. They are not relics of loss but companions in reflection. They are not warnings of destruction but reminders of endurance. They are not empty, they are full, filled with time, with memory, with silence that speaks. In the modern world where noise and haste often surround us, ruins offer something rare, a calm presence that does not demand but simply remains. And so the story of castles continues. From fortresses to ruins, from power to silence, from defense to reflection, they have transformed but not vanished. They still stand scattered across hillsides, beside rivers, within forests, their broken towers reaching upward, their empty halls filled with quiet. They belong not only to the past but to the present, and to all who pause long enough to listen to what silence has to say. As our journey through forgotten castles comes to its quiet end, we are left with images that linger like faint echoes in the mind: broken walls under twilight skies, towers leaning gently into silence, courtyards open to wind and birdsong. These ruins, scattered across landscapes both near and far, remind us of something larger than history alone. They remind us of the slow rhythm of time, of the patience of stone, of the way life rises, falls and transforms. We began with castles at their height, filled with sound, filled with movement, their stones carrying the weight of power and ambition. We saw them guard kingdoms, hold families, endure storms and stand against armies. Yet as centuries passed, those sounds faded. The laughter of banquets, the shouts of soldiers, the songs of minstrels, all drifted away until only silence remained. It is in this silence that we find them today, not as fortresses of command, but as gentle presences of memory. In their ruins there is no longer urgency, there is no longer conflict. There is instead a kind of peace, a stillness that welcomes rather than resists. To stand among fallen arches is not to feel threatened but to feel calmed, as though time itself has softened the stones. Their brokenness is not loss, it is transformation. They have changed from places of defense into places of reflection, from strongholds into sanctuaries of quiet. Throughout history, people have looked upon these ruins and found meaning. For poets, they became symbols of love and loss. For painters, visions of beauty framed in shadow and light. For travelers, places of wonder and rest. And for communities, anchors of identity, steady shapes that remind them of the depth of their past. Even now in the modern world, they continue to serve in these quiet roles, welcoming visitors, inspiring imagination, teaching lessons not only of history but of patience and impermanence. The silence of a castle ruin is unlike any other silence. It is not empty, it is full of memory, of the faint trace of voices once heard, of the strength that has long since passed but still lingers in the air. Walking through such a place, one feels not only the absence of life but also its shadow, its echo. The stones do not speak in words, yet they tell stories. They remind us that time does not erase but transforms, that what once was can still be in a quieter form. And so as we reflect on these forgotten castles, we see not only history but also ourselves. For like these ruins, we too carry marks of time, we too change, soften, endure. Our lives, like theirs, are filled with moments of strength and moments of silence, with chapters of noise and chapters of stillness. To walk among ruins is to be reminded that imperfection can be beautiful, that endurance does not mean remaining the same, but remaining present. In the modern world, we often move quickly. Days are filled with sound, with urgency, with motion. Yet within castle ruins, time slows. The walls ask nothing of us. The towers make no demands. The silence invites us to pause, to listen, to breathe. And in that pause we rediscover something often lost, the simple comfort of stillness. The story of forgotten castles is not only about stone and history, it is about memory, about the endurance of places beyond their original purpose, about the beauty of what remains after change. They stand today as reminders that endings are never final, that silence is never empty, and that what is forgotten can still hold meaning. Perhaps that is their greatest gift, not their strength which has faded, not their power which has passed, but their silence, the gentle enduring silence that calms, that comforts, that carries us softly from the noise of life into the deeper rhythm of time. So as we close this journey, imagine yourself standing before such a ruin. The sky is dim with evening, the air is cool and still. Around you the stones rise, broken but steady, touched by centuries, softened by moss and ivy. No voices disturb the quiet, no armies march across the land. There is only the castle, the landscape and you. A place once filled with noise now offers peace. A place once meant for power now offers rest. In that moment the castle is not forgotten. It is remembered in your presence, in your reflection, in the calm you carry away with you. These ruins live on not only in history books but in the hearts of those who stand before them, those who walk slowly through their courtyards, those who listen to their silence and find in it a mirror of their own quiet thoughts. The castles may have fallen into ruin, but they have not fallen into nothingness. They remain patient and enduring, their silence deeper than sound, their presence stronger than absence. They remind us that even in endings there is beauty and even in ruins there is life. And so the forgotten castles resting in silence and ruin are not truly forgotten at all. They live in memory, in imagination, in the quiet spaces of our minds. They stand not as monuments to what has been lost, but as companions to those who seek calm, who listen, who remember. They remind us that time is not an enemy but a companion, shaping, softening, carrying all things towards stillness. As you drift now into your own silence, into the softer rhythm of rest, carry with you the image of these castles. Their walls may be broken, but their presence endures. Their towers may be roofless, but they still reach toward the sky. Their courtyards may be empty, but they are filled with peace. In their ruins lies not an end but a gentle continuation, a story that whispers rather than shouts, a story that like sleep carries us softly onward. And so the journey ends here, not with noise but with silence, not with urgency, but with calm. The castles remain and so does their quiet gift.